Welcome to the first episode of We Need to Talk. My name is Angshuman Choudhury, and today I have with me Abhinav Borbora, who is a political commentator based in Guwahati, Assam. And I think today we want to chat a bit about what's going on in Assam. There's a lot going on everywhere, given the times we are living in, the pandemic, with the upcoming elections. So a whole plethora of developments are unfolding. And Assam is a state where, in fact, pandemic or no pandemic, there's a lot of things happening at the same time. Right? It's always an interesting geographical, political, and social and cultural paradigm to explore. And I think Abhinav is a very well-placed and apt person to help us make sense of what's happening in the state today. Welcome, Abhinav.
Thank you so much, Angshuman, for having me on your show. And I was looking forward for this episode with 11th column. Thank you once again.
Thanks a lot, and thanks a lot for taking out time. And especially as far as I'm aware, that you did catch the virus at some point in the last month. So and I hope you're fully recovered.
I have fully recovered, and of course, when I look back to those days, initially it was a very traumatic experience because, like, my entire family, my mother, my father, and I, the three of us were infected, and we had to spend almost 2 weeks in the hospital, but finally we got cured. And I think although it was a very harrowing experience when we were going through it, but to potential patients or people who are still struggling with the disease, I think I can advise them that if they maintain a proper healthy mental attitude, I think they would also be able to fight the disease very successfully. And I would also like to say that after recovering from the disease, I have also recently donated plasma, and I would also request all other patients who have recovered also to come forward and donate plasma, because as many people are saying, it actually is one of the more effective lines of treatment of the disease.
Fantastic, and it's good to hear that you had a fairly decent experience with the virus, because of course this is something that I don't think our generation has dealt with in its living memory. A pandemic of this scale. We have a smaller pandemic, so
we have read books about epidemics in the past, in the history, but to live through such an experience, I think, of course, we are at a unique position in history.
Absolutely. Thank you for your appeal, actually, the broader appeal of donating plasma. I think as many hands as we have on the deck today, it's better for our collective goodwill. I think what I want to sort of discuss with you today, the broader question that I want to tackle, or I want us to navigate together, is, can Assamese subnationalism counter Hindutva nationalism? I know, I mean, at the very outset, it's a very ambitious line of interrogation to take. It's a very ambitious question with a broad mandate. But I hope we can sort of talk about certain, sort of disaggregate the question, break it down, and talk about certain aspects so that we can sort of make some sense of the whole, right?
True.
And I think this question actually came to my mind. Has been on my mind for a long time, but particularly came to my mind recently when I was reading about some discussions and some sort of a new discourse about how Bengali subnationalism can be a counter to Hindutva nationalism, and how actually Bengali subnationalism is gearing up to give an antidote to Hindutva nationalism of the BJP and their affiliates. So then this came to my mind that, of course, there is a similar paradigm in Assam, because Assamese subnationalism has been there for a long time. It's been probably the predominant element of Assamese politics in the post-colonial period. It has defined the political life world of Assam in many ways. So I think there is an obvious sort of hypothesis there that pan-Indian Hindutva nationalism will find its sort of challenge, its biggest challenge, in the Northeast in Assamese subnationalism. There is a hypothesis, but to what end that is true is something that I want to explore with you. Just to open, I just have Two related questions on this very specific question that I want to begin with is, does Assamese subnationalism have the capacity to counter Hindutva nationalism? Or, in that similar vein, does Assamese subnationalism even want to counter Hindutva nationalism? I also have a third question. Is this a stupid question to ask? Is this question flawed in your head?
Okay. I think this is a common narrative that is doing the rounds in Assamese civil society and political circles as we are nearing the 2021 elections, wherein Assamese subnationalism is juxtaposed in opposition to Hindutva, whereby Assamese subnationalism, like you have seen, is perceived to be a counter to right-wing Hindutva politics. Now, even as your question indicated, such a juxtaposition, it assumes Assamese subnationalism to enjoy a certain kind of a moral high ground vis-a-vis right-wing Hindutva politics. But if you would ask me, I think that such a juxtaposition is actually very flawed. It's inherently very flawed, and this is because of a number of reasons. The first reason being that Assamese subnationalism is itself not actually representative of the life world of the Assamese society, in the sense that when we traditionally and conventionally understand Assamese nationalism, we are actually referring to the nationalism of the dominant Assamese ethnic identity. But we'll have to understand that Assam is a multi-ethnic, multicultural, and multi-religious territory and cultural space. Secondly, if we go back to history, if we go back even by 30 years, we would find that it is actually Assamese subnationalism that facilitated the entry of Hindutva forces in the state. This happened at a discursive level, and also more prominently, it happened at a political level. To give you a very, very simple example, when the Assam agitation took a violent character from say 83 onwards, the excesses of the movement were largely spearheaded by a force called the ASU Volunteer Corps. That was like a subgroup within the ASU. Now, it is widely alleged that this ASU Volunteer Corps was actively trained and groomed by the RSS leaders and members. And even if you see, even now, the very people who are spearheading right-wing BJP politics in Assam are precisely the same people who till some years back were associated with the ASU, with the AGP, or many of such sundry organizations representing or claiming to represent Assamese subnationalism. It is the same set of leaders. And also, it's not only that it is the same set of leaders who have switched over to the BJP, but even when they retain their distinctive positions, you'd see that at multiple levels, the positions taken by the BJP and the positions taken by ASU, AJYCP, or many of these organizations, they converge at multiple levels. For example, look into the issue of the NRC. You'd see that the NRC was equally supported by both Assamese subnationalist organizations as well as the BJP. Even with regard to the dateline, the preferred dateline of 1951 is not only a position that is upheld by the BJP, but it was one of the core positions of the ASU AJYCP during the movement. And even now, when we are looking at the Clause 6 committee, many of the recommendations that the Clause 6 committee has made, and specifically the dateline issue, it very neatly converges with the position of the BJP on that issue. At a more discursive level, therefore, if we see both Assamese subnationalism and Hindutva are majoritarian in their character, are anti-minority in their character. If you go back to the Assam movement again, the Assam movement had a strong anti-Bengali, anti-Muslim character. Both Hindutva politics as well as Assamese subnationalism have hegemonic aspirations. In fact, if we look into the story of the fragmentation of Assam, it was because of the hegemonic aspirations of Assamese subnationalist politics that actually alienated the numerous non-Assamese ethnic groups from Assamese culture and society. And finally, if we even look into the material aspect, both, and this is something that is not very often mentioned because always the decision is undertaken on the lines of identity and citizenship. Both these currents of thought are anti-labor. Because if you see, even now when we are talking about the contemporary period, we have seen the Union Parliament passing something like the Labour Code Bill, and at one point of time, ASU leaders would actually criticize and hold demonstrations outside the then Assam government, instigating them to actually work for middle class issues and not to, quote unquote, do a politics that represents thelawalas and rickshawalas. And even during the movement, the ASU took a very stringent and very aggressive attitude to labor unions, to trade unions, and also those cadres who belong to political parties who sought to represent labor. So from a lot of angles, therefore, we can see that there are overarching similarities between both these two currents of thought, both these two political ideologies, and I therefore think that it's actually a very flawed juxtaposition. It's a very flawed juxtaposition. It would just be like trying to counter one problem by juxtaposing it with another problem. And so people in Assam who are actually making this kind of a juxtaposition are actually, I believe, they're creating a hierarchy of problems whereby they would tend to regard the Hindutva politics as somehow being a more immediate problem in comparison to issues and contentions that Assamese subnationalism would inevitably create.
Right. Some very fascinating and myth-busting observations there, Abhinav. And actually, it's for the longest time. If anyone observes Assamese politics from a distance, which you don't, you actually observe it very closely, right in the middle of it. So, if one tends to observe it from a distance, there seems to be an inbuilt clash between Assamese nationalism and not just Hindutva nationalism, but any form of pan-Indian nationalism, even Nehruvian secular territorial nationalism. But if you read between the lines and if you read the details, if you observe the microstructures, the political and the material structures, as you observed, it turns out that BJP actually had a very natural foot in the door in Assam. That it's actually not surprising that large sections of the Assamese population actually voted for BJP twice in the 2014 elections and then in the 2016 state elections, right? And, I'm glad actually you talked about the Assam movement context because in my reading, a lot of what is happening today actually has its roots in the Assam movement, particularly in events like the Delhi massacre, right? How you talked about the majoritarian and anti-minority character of the movement and Assamese nationalism. So there's a lot of talk always when we talk about Delhi about how, let's say, Atal Bihari Vajpayee went to Assam and polarized the masses through his ostensibly incendiary speeches, right? So it's almost always, the blame is always shifted on the BJP for the polarization. Blame is always shifted to the BJP RSS elements for the polarization. But the fact is also that the recipients of the polarization also responded to that narrative, that anti-minority, anti-Muslim narrative. So I think a lot of events of post 2014 or post 2016 political scenario in Assam actually can be directly traced back to what happened then. And let's not also forget that actually the RSS is not entirely a new entity in Assam. It's been present in the mid 1960s, and it's been operating in very subterranean ways.
When we look into the rise of the BJP, in a majority of the writings, there is a tendency to look into the immediate rise, and from a historical point, the rise is often traced back to the Assam movement. Of course, the RSS had been there, like you said, actively since the 60s, but the BJP Janasangha's rise is often traced back to the Assam agitation. But what we often overlook, what such writings overlook, is how the emergency in Assam facilitated the entry of the Janasangh into the state and into the corridors of power.
Yeah.
In the post emergency situation, in Gulab Borbora's government, Gulab Borbora, who was a socialist, who was a Lohiite socialist, appointed Lokeshwar Guhai, a Janasangh member, as his revenue minister.
Yeah.
And I think that was the first time that a Janasangh member actually assumed position in the government of Assam.
Yeah.
In the same election, Padmashri Ajoy Dotto, he emerged victorious from the central Guwahati seat, the Guwahati East constituency, which on a Janta Party ticket. So if we look into the rise of the BJP, or the advent of the rise of the BJP, I would not like to trace it back to the emergency, but I think we'd have to go further back. I'm sorry, we cannot trace it back to only to the Assam agitation, but I think we'd have to look how the emergency and the post-emergency Assam government actually for the first time facilitated the entry of the Janasangh into the corridors of government in Assam. And I think that is one dimension that is often overlooked when we come across standard narratives about the rise of the BJP in Assam.
Right. This is quite interesting because, a similar observation can also be made in the national context, because usually the dominant literature around the rise of the BJP and the right-wing Hindutva politics is generally attributed to the events of the late 1980s and early 1990s with the Ram Janambhoomi movement, with the Babri Masjid movement. But actually the right-wing impulse came into the mainstream during the 70s. During the emergency. That was the first time when the BJP, the Jansangh and its affiliates actually had a space in mainstream national politics. They became relevant in a sense. So it actually...
Right. And what is interesting is that at that point of time, they were crusading to restore democratic culture in the country.
Absolutely.
And even leaders like, say, Arun Jaitley or so many other leaders, some days back, I came across this academic paper where apparently Narendra Modi would also organize the smuggling of literature from India to Europe and America to tell the world about the truth of democracy. And someone like Nanaji Deshmukh, along with George Fernandez, Nanaji Deshmukh of the RSS, he was one of the people who would actually take a frontal role in organizing the underground during the emergency. So you're very correct in your observation that even at a national, in national politics, the emergency actually provided an opening and an opportunity for the Indian right.
Right. Then it actually makes me think that the Assam case is actually not an exclusive case. It actually very much mirrors the national political the direction that national politics took in the post-colonial period, because we tend to believe that Assam is a very distinct, peculiar case in some ways because of the existence of so-called quote-unquote identity politics as opposed to a pan-Indian homogeneous identity. Right. So that's quite interesting. Now, I think, as I said, a lot of this can be tied back to what's happening today. Right. The BJP's political victory, which was almost like an unprecedented sweep across the state in 2016 that we saw. So at that time, there was a lot of chatter and there was a lot of discussion about how in the world did a Hindutva party, did a Hindu supremacist party manage to win in a state like Assam, which is very multicultural, which is very multi-ethnic and multi-religious, right? But then, as you observed, made the observations, the devil lies in the details here. When you read, you actually see that the political structures were very sort of conducive for a party like BJP to make its entry into Assam?
I think a number of factors actually allowed the BJP's victory in 2016. Obviously, at some level, there was the enchantment with our current prime minister.
Yeah.
And also, the RSS had been doing groundwork in the state for a long time. And I think, in a way, its pre-existing infrastructure in the state, it aided the advent of the BJP because it also coincided with a time when the Congress organization actually was becoming very inactive. And another thing is that, and something that neither the AGP, who was in power for 2 terms, or the Janata Party, who was in power for a single term, could do, is that the BJP could actually make a cross-sectional advance into the state. If you look at the current electoral base that the BJP enjoys, it is not concentrated on any peculiar community. If you look into, of course, there has been very sizable Hindu-Bengali consolidation in its favor. The Assamese middle classes supported it. But at the same time, in a multi-ethnic society, it is interesting that almost all of the major non-Assamese ethnic groups also supported the BJP and continues to support the BJP. If you look into the 6 scheduled areas, it is interesting that in 2016, I think all of the seats returned BJP candidates. And even in the 6 scheduled autonomous councils, like for example, the Karbi Anglong Autonomous Council or the North Kachar Hill Autonomous Council are currently controlled by the BJP. And this is the case for a majority of the development councils in Assam, which are now controlled by the BJP. So what we look at is a very secular entry into the state. And I think this is significant and this is unrivaled.
Right. This then actually makes me think that Assamese subnationalism, or the Assamese nationalist political milieu, actually it actually never had a problem with pan-Indian nationalisms. Be it Nehruvian territorial secular nationalism or Hindutva nationalism, because in reality, in political terms, the only truly sort of subnationalist party that was in power for a long time was the AGP in the post-Assam movement context. But even the AGP experiment gave away to Congress at the later years, right? So it actually makes me believe that the dominant political impulse in Assam is actually very much conducive or very much facilitative of larger nationalisms or pan-Indian nationalism, right? Even within that, I think, do you believe sort of that the BJP's form, the current form of BJP nationalism or Hindutva nationalism, is a very distinct form of nationalism in itself. It's very different from both the Nehruvian territorial secular imagination of India and also, in some sense, the previous political nationalism of the Atal Bihari Vajpayee government. So, in that sense, my question to you is, the BJP in its current form and its entry into Assam, political entry into Assam, do you think it is somehow changing the fundamental character of Assamese society and politics?
I think BJP, ever since its advent into the state, has definitely tried to push its cultural ideology into Assam. But I don't think that it has done this, not much by supplanting elements outside of the local culture up in the local culture. But if you look at BJP's cultural politics in the state, what it has done is that it has tried to co-opt indigenous culture. And within the indigenous culture, it has sought to amplify the Hindu elements that constitute the indigenous culture. Because when we talk about, say, Assamese culture, even within Assamese culture, there is a strong Hindu element, a strong Hindu constitutive element. So what the BJP has done is that it has actually refrained from importing cultural elements from outside the region and superimposing it on local indigenous culture. But it has, as I have already said, what it has done is that it has tried to bring out and amplify Hindu elements that constitute the local culture. Like if you look at even if you look at the 2016 elections, the entire election was actually turned into, or was made analogous to, the Battle of Horaighat,
Right.
whereby the Congress and the AIDF, or all BJP's opponents, were actually made analogous to the Mughals, and by the same measure they were made analogous to the Muslim infiltrators, and the BJP was portrayed as the Ahoms, as the brave Ahoms who would defend BJP, who defend Assam's Jati Mati Bheti, that is like Assam's identity, Assam's territoriality from an apparent Muslim aggression. At the same time, what the BJP is doing is that it is actively, yet in a subtle way, it is trying to co-opt the Neo-Vaishnavite religious variant, which is extremely strong in Assam. If you see, the RSS is already running a chain of schools in Assam called the Shonkordev Shihu Niketan,
Right.
named after the Neo-Vaishnavite saint Srimanta Shonkordev. At the same time, I think just after coming to power, the BJP renamed major arterial roads in Guwahati after Shonkordev and other Neo-Vaishnavite saints like Damodar Dev and Hari Dev. You'd often find that the BJP is also portraying itself as an organization which is interested in defending Hotro land from encroachment, and obviously the implicit reference is encroachment by the Muslims. So if you see, what it is trying to do is that it is trying to co-opt it is trying to co-opt the local indigenous culture, and also reinterpret and amplify Hindu elements which are constitutive of that culture, and then juxtapose it in opposition to say a Muslim other. I think this is how the BJP's cultural politics could be read, at least till now.
Right. So actually what we see is not really a case of political colonization, but rather very tactful political co-option.
See, in the initial period, it did try to have a festival like the Namami Brahmaputra, whereby an entire Gangetic Sanskritized way of worshipping a river was imposed upon the cultural practices associated with the Brahmaputra. But apart from that, I don't actually recall any such overt colonization of culture. But what we rather see is a subtle attempt, like I said, to co-opt the Hindu elements, or to co-opt the local indigenous culture and amplify and reinterpret the Hindu constitutive elements within that local culture.
Right. That's quite interesting in terms of it's basically a reframing of the BJP's own agenda, a national agenda, to sort of tailor and to tailor make it for Assam by borrowing elements from the local culture. I think any sort of pan-Indian national project would naturally try to do that in a sub-region that is counterintuitive or could be a natural counterforce to its politics. So in that sense, the BJP's political victory is actually a matrix of co-option, as you very comprehensively explained. But I don't think we can talk about this without actually talking about the general popular disdain for so-called quote-unquote illegal migrants that Assam has, and how BJP has actually woven that narrative around and actually amplified the religious binary within that sort of diluted the territoriality of Assamese nationalism and given it a overtly religious flavor, where Muslim undocumented immigrants are seen as outsiders, and the Hindus are actually given a pathway, a bypass in this case through the Citizenship Amendment Act. So in this case, you see this co-option happening at multiple levels. What do you think about this, particularly this illegal immigrant agenda?
I think Assam's tryst with the perception of illegal immigration could be traced back to the colonial period, and of course in the 80s, although the movement claimed a very secular attitude while defining who is an illegal migrant, but even in that understanding at a discursive or at a political level, I think there was a strong anti-Muslim element that was actually there latently. What the BJP has done is definitely it has amplified a latent anti-Muslim element that constructed the perceived idea of the illegal migrant. And what is interesting is that with the Ka amendment legislation, while it has actually helped the BJP consolidate a Bengali Hindu electoral support base in the Barak Valley, in the Brahmaputra Valley, however, it could easily dilute any antagonism of the Assamese speakers, of the Assamese speaking electorate. And one way how it was done is because they could very well play the Assamese off against their perceived fears of a kind of a Muslim aggression from the erstwhile East Bengal areas, from illegal migrants. And I think that is the reason, while the bill proved politically beneficial for the BJP amongst the Bengali Hindus, but when it comes to the Brahmaputra Valley politics, this entire linguistic hostility, it got subsumed within a larger polarization between the Hindus and the Muslims. And this was very easy to do because, like I said, this anti-immigrant movement since the 80s had always a latent anti-Muslim attitude about it, and had always an anti-Muslim perception in terms of understanding or presuming who that illegal immigrant is. And the BJP basically amplified those.
Do you think this subterranean, latent anti-Muslim tendency is now becoming more mainstream in Assam on account of the BJP's politics?
No, definitely. If you even look into the 2019 voting behavior, you see that there is a clear polarization taking place. Now, at one level, it is very natural that there is a Muslim consolidation taking place, and the BJP is actually highlighting the fact that electorally there is a Muslim consolidation taking place. And during the run-up to the 2019 election, ministers, the health minister, actively appeal to the people that people from their own community should therefore come out in large numbers to vote in order to defeat a certain kind of consolidation that is taking place by the apparent other. And therefore, if you look into voting trends, like I said, this entire consolidation and counter consolidation of the Hindus is clearly visible, and that is one of the reasons why the anti-Ka movement actually did not yield any result.
So, I mean, could you say that there is an attempt to co-opt, the Assamese milieu into the Hindi cowbelt framework?
I think there is an attempt to co-opt the Assamese speaking electorate within the fold of a Hindutva politics, and within the fold of a Hinduized understanding of itself.
Right.
And that is already taking place.
Right. So it's less about BJP secularizing itself to fit into Assam, and more about Assam Hinduizing itself to fit into the BJP framework. Do you think that's a fair assessment to make?
It's a counter consolidation of the Hindus, and this is happening because the BJP has been quite successful in stirring up fears of some kind of a perceived aggression of the Muslims. And in terms of the politics, it's actually very convenient for the BJP right now, because even during the 2019 election, there was a Congress AIDF alliance that took place, which actually played into the BJP's trap. And also, when like the voting turnout of the first phase came out, the BJP was very active in showing that localities having a high number of Muslim electorate, they had a very significant turnout. And I think that is why if you closely read the voting behavior from the second and the third phase in the 2019 elections, even areas with a predominantly Hindu population, assembly segments with a predominantly Hindu population, which traditionally have very lower voter turnouts, they also started registering very high voter turnouts. And in a lot of them, they gave a lead to BJP candidates. So I think these are fair enough conjectures at a preliminary level to suggest that there is an emergent Hindu counter polarization, counter consolidation that is taking place.
Right.
And even now, in the run up to the 2021 elections, the more there is talk of a Congress AIDF alliance, the more it is playing into a polarizing trap set by the BJP, I believe.
Right, because we also saw a couple of incidents of, let's say, cow lynchings, cow beef related lynchings in Assam. At least, if not lynchings that led to deaths, they at least led to grievous injuries, if I correctly remember. So this aggressive narrative of a Hindu-Muslim cultural war or a civilizational war, I think it's fair to say that in many ways it has seeped into the mainstream socio-political milieu in Assam. And I think in many ways that's a worrying development. I think I want us to very briefly discuss what this means, what all of this means for the upcoming elections, right? We have a new party that's come up, the Ahom Jatiya Party, Ahom Jatiya Parikhod, or AJP.
Yes.
I really want to know what do you think? What really is the AJP? Is it like old wine in a new bottle? Is it a very new spin-off or a new a constituent of quote unquote Assamese nationalism? What is it really?
Even I am also perplexed by the fact that often we'd find leaders associated with this party saying that this is the time when the ASU leaders are constituting their own political party. Now, why I find it perplexing is that even the AGP was a direct manifestation of the movement and comprised of ASU leaders. And although not as a separate political party, but from 85, every Assam cabinet has top-ranking ASU leaders who are part of those cabinets as cabinet ministers. Yeah. So this new political party, therefore, it is rooted in ideas, and it comprises of people who are largely part of the Assam agitation, who are part of the discursive legacy of the Assam agitation, and in that way, I really do not see anything novel about this political party. And when we talk about the Ahom Jatiya Parikhod, we'd also have to remember that this is not the only regional party that has recently been constituted. In fact, this time we are looking at a lot of other political parties. There is an Ansolik Gana Morcha by senior journalist Ajit Bhuiyan, who is also a Rajya Sabha member, and then we also have a United Regional Party Assam by senior advocate Abhinav Borbora. Now, three of these political parties, I think one of the reasons why they are attracting so much of attention is because of the personalities who are associated with these political parties. But now to come to a question, and I think what you asked could be answered actually for all the three of the political parties. It's personalities actually in politics, they don't get you votes. At one point of time in the 90s, Professor Hiren Gohai and Homen Borgohai, they also constituted an alternative forum to contest, whereby they fielded candidates for the elections to the Guwahati municipal corporations.
Mm.
And interestingly, almost all of the candidates actually defeated and had to forfeit their deposits.
Mm.
What is important is to ascertain whether these political parties and also the Ahom Jatiyo Porikhod, whether it has an adequate organizational structure, whether it has sufficient workers on the ground, and whether it has access to finances.
Mm.
Secondly, because these political parties, including the Ahom Jatiyo Porikhod, these political parties are formed on the anti-Ka plank.
Mm.
But we'll have to understand that the anti-Ka agitation in Assam, it was itself very limited in its scope.
Mm.
Most of the non-Assamese ethnic groups actually did not actively participate in this movement. And by basing an entire political party on an anti-Ka plank, you are actually limiting yourself to 33 odd seats.
Mm.
Out of 126 that comprises the Assam Assembly. Now, if you even go into how these predominantly Assamese seats have voted in the last 2019 elections, when the Ka agitation was at its height, you'd see like seats like Tingkhong, Amguri, Nahorkotia, Koliabor. These seats, they overwhelmingly voted for the BJP in the 2019 elections, when the anti-Ka agitations was at its peak. And it is not only that. If you look at the voting turnout in this predominantly Assamese constituencies, you see, like, for example, in Tingkhong, where apparently Lurin Jyoti Gogoi is planning to contest, the BJP candidate won by a margin of 28,000 votes, and the voting percentage was 77%. So it's not as if people were disillusioned. What I'm trying to say is that even in these Assamese constituencies, on the basis of which these political parties are getting constituted, they returned Hindu candidates and they actively supported the BJP. So I think these kind of actual trends on the ground put a big question on the actual relevance of these regional parties, which are proliferating nowadays in Assam.
Right. It almost seems like this is kind of a false opposition, not really a meaningful opposition. And anyway, what seems like it right now, that there is no united regional front, which was talked about a lot. And there are various parties, and very interestingly, what you pointed out, that in many ways they all feed back to the BJP narrative, or the BJP sort of way of doing politics, right? So do you think in many ways this is actually a blessing in disguise for BJP? Because firstly, all of these parties are behaving pretty much like how the BJP would. And secondly, there is a divided opposition, simply speaking. And for a party like BJP, a divided opposition is almost like a blessing, right? So do you think this lack of unity within the regional parties and the failure to form a united regional front actually forewarns another BJP victory in Assam in 2021?
See, I think these political parties, the regional political parties that have been formed, even if they're united, their collective strength or their individual strength is extremely insignificant. These are peripheral players.
Mm.
I think that is something we need to understand. Like, for example, Ojit Bhuiya's political party, or say the Arup Borbора's political party. These parties do not even have a significant presence on the ground. These are political parties, I would like to believe, which are propped by the Assamese media, which are propped by a section of the Assamese intellectuals and civil society elite. But on the ground, whether they align or whether they contest separately, I don't think these political parties could actually make any major difference to how the electoral turnout would unfold. Of course, an alliance between the Congress and the AIUDF, I think that definitely has a lot of potential, because it would prevent a split of the Muslim vote. But again, a potential alliance between the Congress and the AIUDF means a counter consolidation of the Hindus, and in that way also,
Absolutely.
such an alliance can play into the BJP's polarizing trap.
Absolutely.
So I think it's a complicated, it's a very depressing reality for opposition politics in Assam. And one more thing I would just like to add is that this is a phase in Assam's opposition politics where we see the ethnicization of opposition politics in Assam. No, what I mean is that if you look at political parties like the Congress or CPI, CPIM, the AIUDF, or even pressure groups like the AMSU or the KMSS, you would see that these opposition forces are increasingly trying to counter the BJP by taking a line which is extremely close to the agenda or the traditional agenda of Assamese ethno-nationalist politics. And what is happening in that process is that it is simultaneously alienating all other non-Assamese groups. Today, if I can share it with you, there we see a significant rightward shift of non-Assamese social groups. The T tribes, for that matter, which constituted the bulk of the Congress's electoral support base in Upper Assam, today the entire T belt has actually shifted loyalties to the BJP. You look at it in 2016, you observe 2019. In a majority of the seats where the T community is in a decisive position, they have overwhelmingly voted for the BJP.
Right.
Take the instance of the Hindi-speaking community in seats like Tinsukia. In the Tinsukia constituency, you see a BJP member, a BJP legislator being victorious, and this is the first time that a non-Congress member has won that seat, and the last time it was won was way back in 1978. You look into, like I have already mentioned in the beginning, all the 6 scheduled districts, all the autonomous councils, and what is interesting is look at how Boro politics is unfolding. There is a certain hostility between the BPF and the UPPL, but still both the political parties seem to be favorable to the BJP.
Right.
So even the opposition politics has not been able to exploit the internal difference between the BPF and UPPL as of now.
So in a sense, what comes out, the bigger picture that comes out here is that we are seeing a lot of so-called regional counter BJP parties or anti-BJP parties coming up, but the overall political equations that the BJP has managed to forge across Assam is actually plays against the advantage of these Assamese dominant regional formations. Yes. I'm just going back to the AGP here because I find the framing very interesting. It's called the Ahom Zatiyo Parikhod, as opposed to the previously the other party, the AGP, the Ahom Gana Parikhod. Here, of course, Gana means masses or public, and Zatiyo means the ethnic identity, the ethnicity. Do you think there is some meaning in this difference, or it's just a nominal change, or it's just about a nominal shift in name?
I think rather than trying to mark a difference by the kind of nomenclature that the new party has used, I think they would actually like to create a certain similarity with the AGPs, with the name of the AGP, at least in terms of the acronym. And because I think the new party believes that there is a certain nostalgia that it wants to tap into. And because if you look into the statements made not only by the AJP but by a majority of these regional forces, one strain that is common is that the AGP betrayed Assamese nationalism, and therefore we need to substitute the AGP with a new nationalism. So therefore, for these people, there is no problem with the AGP's variant of nationalism. It is just that the AGP has betrayed a certain a nationalist sentiment, subnationalist sentiment, and by forming a new party, they want to just tap into that sentiment. They want to just recover that sentiment from the AGP. So I think rather than a difference in terms of how the new political party has been made, if you see AGP, AJP, it sounds also very similar.
Yes.
And one of the reasons I think is because it wants to tap into that emotion that it believes is associated with the AGP and the movement.
I mean, in itself, like the one of the mottos that the AJP has floated is "Aham Pratham."
See, you are having a difficulty differentiating
absolutely
both the names.
Exactly, and I mean, it's going around saying "Aham Pratham Hodai Aru Sirodin," which is Assam first. Every day and always, right? I mean, that has almost been the soul of the Assamese ethno-nationalist paradigm for the longest time. So it probably is just a reformulation, a nominal reformulation of what we have been seeing in Assam for the longest time, right? For the last 4 or 5 decades. And I also find it very interesting that the other motto that the AJP has floated is "Ghore Ghore Ami," which is we are in every household, right? And if I remember correctly, one BJP state minister recently quipped that they have actually taken the slogan from "Har Har Modi, Ghar Ghar Modi." I mean, to be honest, I don't think I can deny that they do seem very similar conceptually. What do you think?
Well, they are similar conceptually, politically, even ideologically. Like you stated in the very beginning, is the juxtaposition or even questioning about the juxtaposition, is it stupid? I think it's a very flawed juxtaposition to begin with. Yes, if we actually try to scrutinize it more deeply, I think it cannot actually withstand more serious scrutiny.
Right. Makes sense. So I think this was a great conversation we had. We began with a flawed question. We began with a stupid question. But I think the point was to actually scrutinize the narrative that's on the ground, the intellectual, the political, and the academic narratives around this, and the dominant sort of chatter around this is definitely at some level the speculation that Assamese subnationalism can be an effective counterforce. But thank you very much, Abhinav, for actually demystifying this, and actually more importantly reading between the lines, because that's what most distant, or I wouldn't even say distant, most close observers of Assamese politics miss. So I think these were very refreshing takes, and I think 2021 is going to be a very interesting year and when we talk about Assam, there's a whole host of things that we have to talk. The entire so-called illegal immigration agenda is a whole different topic of discussion. The NRC is a different discussion, and I can really hope that I can get you on board again in the future to discuss those things also.
I think it was this session itself makes me want to have another session with you, because it was very interesting. And yes, I think these are things that the electorate also needs to understand. And one thing that I have always been saying, that if we actually need to identify a political problem, we cannot do it in a hierarchical manner whereby we make these false binaries and these false juxtapositions. I think these kind of juxtapositions and the expectations and the disillusionment that it always, and it would inevitably lead, I think this would lead to a kind of a voter fatigue. And I think it is important for the voters to know these flaws in the way the narrative is being sought to be created.
Absolutely. Abhinav, thank you so much for joining me. I'm sure a lot of our viewers and listeners will actually gain a lot of new perspectives from this podcast, and I hope they do. I hope you can join me again in the future to discuss the things that we left out this time.
Yes.
Bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.